This is our Skyscapes program number 24. It's called Prison and the Imagination, with Ngugi wa Thiong'o in conversation with Maya Jasanoff. Now, this particular session is sponsored by Naropa University. So I would like to introduce Jeffrey Petherbridge of Naropa, who's going to say a couple of words, and then we'll get going.
Thank you all, friends, comrades, for coming. When it was our decision to choose this session to sponsor, it seemed one of the most crucial issues, the way in which prison spreads as an institution and how it threatens personhood, and whereas the imagination is a faculty through which personhood and living is constituted and sponsored. These are the missions of Naropa, and we thought it was a good mix. We hope you'll enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Prison and the Imagination. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you to Naropa for sponsoring this, and of course to the Boulder Public Library. This is a gorgeous space, and what a great place to be able to have this conversation. So, you know, it's such a cliche to say somebody needs no introduction, but my feeling is that Ngugi deserves an introduction, whether he needs it or not. So you will, of course, know him as prolific, erudite, piercing, and eloquent commentator on colonialism and its aftermath. He's the author of more than 30 novels, plays, books of essays, children's books, and particularly over the last decade or so, a series of memoirs. He was born in 1938 to a large peasant family in rural Kenya, at the time, of course, a colony of the British Empire, and he came of age, as those of you who have read his memoirs and work will know, during the Mau Mau Rebellion and the brutal counterinsurgency by the British that took place at the same time. Against this backdrop, he went to an English language boarding school, Alliance High School, followed by Makerere University and the University of Leeds, and he burst onto the literary scene in the early 1960s with a series of novels, my favorite of which is A Grain of Wheat from 1967. A decade later followed his novel Petals of Blood, which was soon followed as well by a play in Gikuyu, which is translated as I Will Marry When I Want. And this play got Ngugi imprisoned without charge by the government of Daniel Arap Moi. He decided henceforth to write fiction in Gikuyu, including his first novel in Gikuyu, which is translated as Devil on the Cross, which was written on squares of prison toilet paper. I should say this is the first novel in Gikuyu. Forced into exile in 1982, Ngugi has for about 30 years now lived and taught in the United States and is currently Distinguished Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Irvine. He is the recipient of 11 honorary doctorates, unless there's another one that's come along that I haven't kept track of. There are a lot.
12.
12, okay. So we're up to a dozen, and there will doubtless be a dozen more to come. These include Yale, NYU, the University of Auckland, University of Dar es Salaam, and Bayreuth University. And I mention these to give you a sense of the absolutely global impact that Ngugi's writing has had. And he's the winner of innumerable prizes, including the Nonino International Prize in Literature, and he is regularly tipped for the Nobel Prize in Literature. So get your bets running for the 2019 competition. So this session is entitled Prison and the Imagination, but in the blurb below it points out that Ngugi has written so much and extensive and thoughtfully about language and its role in national culture, history, and identity. And I wanted to ask you, to kick things off, I mean, of course, like many African novelists, you published your first works of fiction in your non-native language, that is to say, English. What do you remember about the process of learning English? What were your first words in English?
Oh, I cannot remember. Maybe good morning. Oh, yeah, good morning. So,
Okay.
Well, good morning, sir. Oh, yes, actually, when the teacher enters the class, or we're supposed to say, good morning, children, we're supposed to say, good morning, sir. Yeah.
Can you
Oh, can you hear me? Okay. That's what I think, because we didn't test the mic. This is how you do it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Good morning.
Anyway, I think what I remember now that you have asked me that one is the teacher coming to class and he said good morning, and you just say good morning, sir. So that, oh yes, and also we got so used to say good morning, sir, that even when a female teacher or visitor came, we said good morning, sir. Because with us, sir was part of the good morning, right? Yeah. Good morning, sir. Yeah. I was glad to make use of that, actually, in my second novel to be published, Weep Not Child, which is really about which draws from my childhood and so on. I do actually have a section of learning English in such a school. And the teacher would put something like, say the word stand, and then he'd go through the routine. Stand up. What are you doing? I am standing up. And that kind of thing. And then later, what is she doing? I am standing up. Yeah. Good morning, children. Good morning, sir. So I portray, one time there's a visit to school by an English teacher, a lady teacher. Said, good morning, children. Good morning, sir. And this, of course, makes the teacher, African teacher, so embarrassed, that when the visitor has gone away, he promises to give corporal punishment to the children for embarrassing her, the teacher. Yeah.
My mother was raised in immediately post-colonial India, and she also learned English as a second language, and remembers, often tells the story of going for her school interview at the age of 5 at an English language school and being asked what the female of a peacock is. Of course, she had absolutely no idea. And then the teacher said, well, what's the female of a cock? And so then my mother was able to come up with peahen, and thus began, this tremendous educational trajectory in the English language. You talk in your memoirs about your discovery of, among others, of course, Shakespeare and many other English writers. And you talk about the ways, if I read you correctly, that English kind of opened your imagination. And yet, when and how, if at all, did you ever see the English language as also a prison? Because these two forces seem to work contrapuntally for you.
Not until much later. My discovery of my mother tongue as an instrument of thinking, writing, consciously so, was to come years, later. So you can see in my more recent writings, I keep talking about the prison house of language. And this is basically because I come to realize what was I doing? Let me put it this way. I was writing, I started writing in 1962. I was a second-year student, I think, at Makerere University College. And Makerere in those days was actually an overseas college of the University of London, as were also many other colleges established in the Caribbean and Malaysia, which had the same kind of pattern of education, which was linked very much to England and so on. So my first 4 novels, first Weep Not Child, The River Between, A Grain of Wheat, and even Petals of Blood were all written in English. But if you look at the content, I'm talking about the history of Kenya, the struggles of ordinary men and women in Kenya, but I was making them articulate their own thinking in English. Yeah. So I keep on talking much more. Recently I talk a lot about Prisoner House of English and French and Portuguese for an African writer. Yeah. This doesn't mean by any that English language or French don't have much to offer. They have a lot to offer. And as I say, my Shakespeare is always around me, right? Even when I went to prison in 1977, I remember thinking about a character in Shakespeare, Richard the First, I think, who is imprisoned, the king who is imprisoned, and that kind of thing. So Shakespeare is all around me, but so I make a distinction between English as a language and whatever is contained in English. And my argument has been that English and French are not more of languages than any other, So you see, we actually live through a lie. By a lie, I mean when we are conditioned to associate knowledge, the act of knowing, associating it with English, so that what is in English sounds clever, intelligent, and more articulate. And what is in Gikuyu or an African language sounds a little bit like, oh wow, not really, not real knowledge, yeah. And it's because the colonial education as a whole conditioned the recipient to think of English and French and Portuguese, depending on where you are. They could associate that with knowledge. I said, yes, in those languages, you can distinguish between the language as a system of communication and language as a repository, of knowledge. They are all connected. But there's another factor which I may mention here. If you look at the colonial experience everywhere, we get the same pattern about the imposition of English or French or Portuguese. I can go as far back as 1596, when Spencer publishes a book called A View of Ireland, present time or something like that. A present view of it is a view of Ireland. And in this book, he talks about it's a conversation basically between a kind of Platonic dialogue between an English lord and an English settler in a province of Ireland called Munster. Now, this was at the beginnings of the English settlements in Ireland, okay? And during that time, Irish as a language was more intellectually advanced than, say, English or French. And there's much more written in that language than probably any other. So highly developed, particularly the liturgical literature and so on. Now, but they began this system of insisting that Irish must not be spoken anywhere near any one of the English plantations. And in fact, they did actually pass laws literally punishing anybody who would be caught speaking Irish, including English planters themselves. So we got to find 1596 or 97 when this policy has failed. Okay, so Spencer and these two characters are asking themselves, why is it we are not able to tame the Irish? How can we erase their memory of who they are? And they come up with two propositions. One is language, right? Again, emphasizing language. And the other one is their naming system. In fact, categorically, one of the interlocutors in the work talks about this as a means of making, if you can strike out, he says, O's and all, like I talk about Mark so and so, or London or Ruach or something. If you can strike the O, contemporary O's and the others and marks, you'll soon make the Irish forget who they are. So it's because like a prescription for the loss of Irish memory of who we are. Now we're talking about 16th century, right? But the same attitude later, you find it in most of the English colonies, The best example is the very famous Menace on Education, when the British were trying to establish, finding out which was the best language for education system. Obviously, India had a long history of writing Sanskrit with the great, epics like Mahabharata and Ramayana and others. Okay. But when they introduced English as a means of education with what Macaulay said, that we want to create a class of Indians in name, religion even, and everything else, but with an English mind, right? The emphasis being on the English mind. And he's quite honest about this. And it's not for the aesthetic purposes of seeing, Indian kids speaking English. No, he's quite categorically, this class with the English mind will help us, be able to manage this vast population. In other words, quite clearly there, the idea was to create a class that has a mind set or looks at the world through the English eyes, and this class will be the one helping in the implementation of colonial policies. You internalize those. You internalize Englishness. So whatever policy you make is conditioned already by the fact you have internalized, English and so on. But then you find the same pattern exported elsewhere, Let me just mention two more as examples of this, In America, we're in America, correct? Yeah. Colorado is in America, correct? Yeah. In America, with Native Americans, right? And you can Google this. There's an expression called, kill the Indian and save the man, right? This actually was articulated by one guy called Captain Pratt, who founded Carlisle School in Philadelphia for Native American kids from the West who are uprooted and taken to that school. And within the first day of arrival, they find a piece of paper on the blackboard, and every student is supposed to point at any one of those, whichever. So as soon as you point at that piece of paper is pinned on your back in the front or somewhere. Okay, that actually was an English name. So they were picking English names within the first days of their arrival in this boarding school. Later Pratt, in an interview, was to say his philosophy for doing so. It was to kill, this is phrase not mine, kill the Indian to save the man, right? So you can see parallel between that again. Macaulay, Spencer in case of Ireland, Macaulay in case of India, and Pratt in the case of the American, situation. And you can find the same thing over and over again, So what's happening here was obviously you make students internalize associate intelligence and capacity to know the world only through English and so on. Yeah,
So-
but I didn't come to this easily. I mean, it's not I woke up one day and was able to philosophize all that.
Yeah.
It took prison. It took my being imprisoned in 1977 in a maximum security prison. It took prison to make me see the light. Yeah.
And what was it about the prison experience that made you reconceive your relationship to English?
I talk about this, I read about this in my recent memoir called Wrestling with the Devil. Wrestling with the Devil. Now, what happened was this. In 1976, some of us professors at the University of Nairobi also started working with the communities outside big city. Now, if you go and work with the community, you cannot, and you really want the community to participate in whatever you're doing. You cannot go there. You can only do so by the language, through the language they speak. It's common sense. You can't go there and tell, we shall teach you English first in order for me and you to be able to communicate to you. If you are producing in a communal sense, you have to use the language that people use, right? So that's how we came to write that play called Almaro When I Want in Gikuyu language. And it became very, very successful. So a community effort really, acted literally by the working men and women of that village, which was about 30 kilometers from Nairobi. Now the play was stopped in November 1977. And on midnight of December 31st, literally, police surrounded my house, which was actually almost like this. It was round. I like round, but they surrounded my house, and they picked me. And the following morning, the morning of January 1st, 1978, I found myself a prisoner without a name. I was just a number. Okay. Now, it was while actually I was in prison, and I talk about it here. Actually, I've been wrestling with the idea, why have I been put in prison for writing a play, and in which, where many people can, find their role, so to speak, or a picture of themselves, right? So that was the beginning of my questioning, the question of the relation between English, French, Portuguese, and African, language realities. And that's where I made a decision, is a connection, decision to write my first novel in Gikuyu language. And the novel is called Wrestling with the Devil. Yeah. So this memoir is wrestling with the devil, of the devil on the cross. I talk about my experience in writing that novel in a maximum security, prison. So prison then became very, very important for me. And please, you can avoid, don't go to prison. You don't need to. You don't need to go to prison to make a breakthrough. It's horrible. But nevertheless, it was prison condition that made me turn around to writing in Gikuyu. After really going through the kind of thinking I was articulating earlier of how European languages were used as colonizing the mind of the middle class, of the colonized. Yeah.
So I think one of the things that's so rich about your work is that you are able to kind of show us binaries, but then take us across them and back and forth in interesting ways. And so, for example, the irony is that had you written that play in English, you might not have been taken off to prison by this government.
Yeah.
So here's a question, though,
In fact,
in reverse.
I read it with a friend of mine called Michelle Mogo, who is a professor at Syracuse University, and who was also forced into exile. We had written an English play called The Trial of Daniel Kimathi, which in some ways was much more radical in terms of interpretation of history than even Almario and I want. But nothing really happened to us then. It's when I wrote in Gikuyu, and the actors were from the village, that I found myself in a maximum security prison. Yeah.
So the form of the novel is very much tied up, as you know, in the European tradition with the making of European nation states and empires. So this is another way that I think you're crossing lines in an interesting way, because you're taking Gikuyu language, but then you're using this very this sort of preeminent, if I can say, imperialist genre. What are your thoughts about that relationship between the form of the novel and the language that you're writing in?
No, not quite. I don't think the novel as a form is imperialistic. But I mean, it's not. Okay, we start with the proposition that there's no language which is more of a language than any other. That every language has its musicality, unique musicality. There are things you can say in Hindi that you may find it difficult to quite express in English or French and so on. And there are things you can say in French and English that you may find difficult to translate, say, in Gikuyu or any other African language. And the beauty of languages is that is this musicality, even in the tiniest language, okay? And that musicality is what gives each language its distinctive, character and so on, okay? But languages have a lot to give to each other, because within that musicality, they produce other important, there's a whole history, and a history of intellectual production in that language. And languages can therefore talk to each other. They can borrow from each other, add to each other. So what was wrong in a colonial system of language, like the Pratt School, Carlisle School, is not that English and French and other languages were taught. No. It was their relationship to the languages of the colonized. That was the key. It's nothing to do with the musicality of English. It's fine. But the relationship between that language and the languages spoken by, say, the colonized community. Okay. Yeah. In every colonial situation that I have studied, or wherever there is differential power between, say, languages and cultures, it's always the same assumption that my language, the conqueror, is more of a language than any other language. the language had nothing to give. Okay, and it's not true. It's like saying, I said before, like saying, my God is more of a God than your God. And I find that very ungodly. You ask me what's ungodly. Somebody say, my God is more of a God than your God. It's very ungodly. And actually, this is really true, of languages. But languages can give to each other. In my memoir, I talk about how I felt whisperings, if you like, from English literature. I mentioned Shakespeare. But there are other whisperings which although I'm not written about it here, but there's another whispering I got from prison when, although I was not allowed paper and pen, later a piece of paper from a magazine came into our hands. And there's a story I read there about Tagore. You know Tagore? Yeah, Tagore, great, Bengali language writer, but also Nobel laureate and so on. And he tells this story of a young Indian writer who comes to see the great writer, well known, friends of Yeats and Tolstoy and all that. Okay, and the young man, he wants to show how knowledgeable he is, So Tagore asks him, how many languages do you know? And of course, he's so happy. He counts the language, English, French, whatever, Huh? And Tagore, I assume he's nodding. Then he asks him, do you know your mother tongue? He said, oh no. Huh? Then Tagore says to him, then you don't know any language at all, right? Yeah. So it's really, if you know, let me put it this way. I always argue that if you know your language, your mother tongue, or the language of your community, and add English and French and Portuguese and Chinese and Russian and whatever other language you want to add to it, that to me is tremendous empowerment, right? But the other way around, where you know all the languages of the world, but your language or your community, you don't know, you're an outsider to that language, that's no longer empowerment, that's alienation. One is empowerment, and alienation. The same thing with the literature. Literature from in the different languages can relate to each other, right? And I personally, writing in Gikuyu, I hear whispering from Tagore, whispering Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, English writers, Dickens, and French Flaubert, and all the others, all the Spanish writers and so on, right? So that's really the problem. The problem is not English or French per se, it's their relationship, an equal relation of power with the dominated languages.
So,
Another thing we might mention here, because if you look at what actually is wrong in the language systems in the world and cultures, is they are being conceived in terms of hierarchy. I say, my language is more of a language than others. Then, when people struggle for liberation, they may be tempted to then take another language and say, this language is more of a language than other languages. In other words, seeing the relationship between languages and cultures in terms of hierarchy. Hierarchy is a problem, not the language per se. It's the hierarchical arrangement in terms of power, okay, right? But languages, they can also network. And network is a very different concept than from the one of, yeah.
But we live in a world now where, of course, the formal structures of empire are gone, and yet, when it comes to language, right? I mean, English has become more and more and more and more of the dominant language, at least if you look at the internet. Of course, there's a Chinese internet and so on as well. But what's your sense of how should we kind of make sense of the, as it were, the persistent inequalities among languages and the persistent sort of marketplace for certain literature in certain languages, translated into those languages, and so forth?
By the way, in your book, she wrote a very interesting book. Can I digress a little bit? Have you read her book, Joseph Conrad? It's a brilliant piece of detective work. You don't mind my doing a little advertisement and so on for
I'm proud to have it.
For your honor. Book. Really, it's incredible. You please read it, even if you don't know the work of Conrad, because it's very interesting as it's kind of historical detective or whatever. But one of the things I found very interesting, Conrad, by the way, was Polish. Okay, and Poland was dominated by Russia for many years. And and so Conrad learned English at a much later stage. I think at 19 or something like that. In fact, he knew French better than he knew English at the time. And then he wrote this brilliant novel that every writer, I call him a writer's writer, because there's no writer who can read without being impressed by how he manipulates sentences and so on, But there's one thing which really touched me in that book. She tells the story of how Conrad, this brilliant novelist who added so much to English literature, already well known, and then he published another noise, under Western Eyes. He goes to his publisher, and there is a kind of quarrel or whatever, And when Conrad returns to his house, he has almost a mental breakdown. Not because the book was rejected, although it was not, but because the publisher told him he does not speak English. He had a mental breakdown. Novelists in English, well known, and so on. So, this in a way can show how a language can colonize the mind of a person. But in reality, as I said, every language has a lot to give to other languages, and we can learn from each and every language, really.
We can, although in the U.S., people who speak English as a first language infamously don't learn the languages of other parts of the world.
That's they call the prison house. Because they remain a little prison, okay, called English and so on, Another saying, I'm always saying this, so you'll find it, I always say that, multilingualism, many languages, is the real oxygen of cultures, because, but monolingualism is a carbon monoxide of cultures, So multilingualism, the oxygen, monolingualism, carbon dioxide. And that's why you find in a language, whether English and so on, even if you try to make it one uniformity, there's kind of, even within the language, there's a rebellion with even dialectical forms emerging from it. If you go to London, you go to East London, the Cockney is spoken there. And no matter how many years you've been learning English, you can't hear what they're saying, right? In fact, I remember this coming from the colonies. I went to Leeds, by the way, university. We go to England for the first time. In a colony, you are taught correct English. We say that people are being made to speak English through the nose, because, because when we had the English settlers in Kenya start talking, it sounded as if they were talking through their nose, good morning, or whatever, you know. So, so we thought this is, having learned English in a colonial situation, we thought we knew the language very well. So we got to Yorkshire, and they talk about words like Louvre, or instead of love, they're talking Louvre, Louvre. And I remember this very clearly because we were laughing at the English. They don't know their language. That's what, you know. And just later I was horrified. Years later, when thinking about this, oh my God, how could we have come to, how could we have said that, right? But what I'm trying to say is essentially that even within English, language is always trying to breathe oxygen by breaking through the systems and so on. And people are always trying to hold it together in a kind of systematic grammar, which is fine, but you can see language is always rebelling. You know, in the Caribbean it takes one form, within African American it takes another form, and so on. In England, it takes some regional forms and so on. You know, right? Yeah.
So speaking of language and rebellion and power, I want to ask you one last question before turning it over to the audience, so I'm sure we'll have lots of questions for you. So, you know, right now in the US, the politics of language has become, among other things, the politics of the presidential tweet. And I actually just spent the first half of this year myself in India, where I started to learn Hindi. And I found this process of learning a new language at my age both kind of daunting, but also totally fascinating because it just opens up so many prospects. So now what I do is when I look at the news, I try to look at the BBC Hindi webpage, and I have a lot of trouble with the vocabulary, but I can always understand the Trump quotes in Hindi because his vocabulary is so small that it's really easy to understand it in translation. But what I wanted to ask you about this is, you know, you've of course dealt so much in your life and in your work with language and power and resistance. What advice do you have, if any, for people right now in the US who hope to keep using language as a tool of resistance in the age of Trump?
Oh, always find a connection between languages. Really, connect is my key word I keep on talking about. It's the same that network. Connect. You only connect. Language are connected. Cultures are connected. Even immigrant cultures, we are all come from immigrant cultures. They are connected, and so on. Because the other system is where you try to put you in a little linguistic island, you know, called English or called proper, not you call it English, called proper English, correct English, and so on. Yeah. I think resistance should take the form also, linguistically anyway, also trying to connect with other languages. And I'm telling you, it's so fascinating when you do that. Now I'm totally envious of people who know more than one language. So I've met some people who can speak 7 languages, you know. Like you, I've been trying to learn Hindi, for instance. I just want the sound of Hindi language. And I remember when we met in New Delhi. Yeah, I was visiting India at that time, and everywhere I go into a taxi, I'd make sure that the taxi driver, whoever was Hindi speaker, so I'd start by Namaste, and he would say, hey, Namaste, and say, Kaisa ho? Acha. Do you speak Hindi? All right, yeah. But I find it very fascinating. It's a very fascinating language. And now I'm wondering, how does it feel? Oh my God, if I could read, say, Ramayana in the original Sanskrit, you know, how, I know I'll never be able to do it, but I'm very fascinated, yeah.
Well, We have about 15 minutes left for questions, and I'm sure there are many in the audience. So some microphones will be going around. Gentleman right here in the front row.
Thank you. In fact, with my Indian heritage, I can relate to what you said about colonialism through language. But my question to you, in fact, I have two related questions. Do you think in your mother tongue and then write in English? And related to that is, when you write a novel, do you have an objective in mind in the sense, or do you simply want to express yourself, or do you want to change the word, make a social impact, etc.? The relationship I had in mind, if you are expressing yourself, then perhaps you might be thinking in your language and then writing in English.
This is a very fascinating thing. I've thought that it's a great deal, and I've come to the conclusion that much of African writing in English is actually exercise in translation. This is what I mean. In many of African novels in English that you read, you'll find a writer depicting a peasant character, a farmer, who has not been to school or to a formal school, okay? So in a novel, these peasant characters, they are talking to each other, but in the novel you are writing, they are speaking to each other in English, right? As characters, right? Although you are wanted there to understand they are really speaking Igbo or Gikuyu and so on, but in reality, they are voicing whatever their thoughts in voicing their thoughts in English, they're actually translating. Okay, so there's a lot of exercise in translation. Every novel, more or less, that's written by the speaker of one language, but writing it in another language, really is an exercise in translation. When you mean the characters speak, particularly if you want to feel that they are talking as within, say, the grammatical structures of the language of their community. Then when you try to render that in English, you're actually doing a lot of what I call mental translation, right? Of course, there's a difference now that there are people, because of that education inheritance in Africa, there are children who they don't know their mother tongue. Even though they live in Kenya or Nigeria, they cannot communicate with their grandparents. They live in a linguistic universe different from that of the community. But even when they come to write and they represent peasant characters, there's an element of mental translation in that exercise. The same with me, obviously, when I'm writing. When I was writing my novels in English, the river between Weep Not Child, A Grain of Wheat, and Petal Blood. You can hear my novels. Hello?
It's okay when it's the speaker's phone.
Yeah.
But now we want to see what language he answers it in.
Yeah. No, I'm not going to answer. I'm just going to. Jockey. Devo chamana ino kalora doi. Dari horwa rodiomi. Quanto qualia. Yeah. No. That was my daughter. It's very. My daughter. Let me digress a little bit. That's my daughter, Jockey. And Jockey, my daughter, is a character in my prison memoir. Because when I was arrested on the midnight of December, that was 1977, with the police surrounding my home in the village, Jockey was in her mother's tummy. I did not know. I learned later when I was in prison, when I get a letter, although very highly censored, but said talk about the birth of Jockey, right? And so the prisoners baptized her and called her post office baby. Kanaka Fodita, because we learned about her birth through a letter written in the post, so that's what we call her, Kanaka Fodita. Now, ironically, she's the one who was calling from. She lives in Georgia, and she was calling from Georgia. Yeah, she's in his memoir. Yeah. So yeah, let's go back to the question. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? I'm sure. Over here.
Thank you. Well, I want to say it's wonderful to listen to you, to both of you. I also want to say that I've lived in a foreign country for 54 years. I was born the same year as you in 1938. Okay. Language has always been a big thing because I learned second language, Italian, after I was 28 years old. And I was born in western South Dakota, and the first time I saw an oil painting or heard a foreign language was when I was in college. So I really want to say to all of we Americans, I'm also Italian, but we Americans, we have an excuse for not knowing the second language. Because I was 1,050 miles, more than that, from Mexico to learn Spanish. I was a long ways away from any of the countries, but in Italy, where I lived in northern Italy, my husband it was easy for him to learn because they know how to teach Italian language better than the American schools. And, you just go 2 hours north, you can speak German. 3 hours east, you can speak French. It's very close, and that country is over thousands of years old, and they've been occupied by different languages for years. And instead, South Dakota, where I was born, it's 150 years old. And the United States is 350 years old. So I think what we need to do is improve how we teach language. And in the States, it's very superficial and unsatisfactory, as far as I know, up to the 1960s. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I'm a great advocate of people knowing more than one language. You can. It's very fascinating. I'm also learning Spanish a little bit. So I'm trying, because anyway, it's good to learn another language. But most important, really quite frank, we really have to struggle against monolingualism as a concept. When people say America is an English-speaking country, true, but there are also very many other languages within America, but they're kind of suppressed, right? But they're there, and they're unique, sort of. It's like a library. We're in a library. Think of languages also as libraries, repositories of knowledge, because any language is a depository of many knowledges within a community. For instance, every language knows its ecology better than probably any other language, and they may have names of different plants and their uses and so on. So each language is a library, is a repository, of knowledge. And just as you are horrified, or I am horrified, when hear of the burning of books in Nazi Germany, or the burning of Alexander Library in Egypt during the Napoleonic occupation of Egypt, or how the Spanish missionaries did to the thousands of years of history of Maya civilization, which was recorded and so on. And they would hunt every manuscript and burn it and so on. Just we are horrified by those, acts. We should even be more horrified by loss of languages. And I don't think we're doing ourselves a favor as human beings, to suppress other languages. It's like, if I look at the image of the musical instrument, and these days I'm talking a lot about the musical instruments. because I'm learning the piano. Yeah.
A lot of
yes.
learning going on, I
Oh
have to
yes.
say. This is
I
great.
got a piano. I got a piano teacher, and she used to teach my children. But when they went to high school and I played them, they became very tired. I said, I continue. Although my wife said, let's continue. So I started taking lessons, from her. And she is, of course, used to teaching children. So whenever I do very well, she gives me a little smiley too. Say, next time I'll give you 2. But anyway, I've been thinking about musical instruments quite a lot. And as I said earlier, there's no musical instrument that is more of a musical instrument than any other. But each of those musical produce very unique sounds. Say the violin, the piano, the organ, or the lyre, or whatever. They produce very unique sounds, okay? Right? So you don't want to banish all musical instruments and say, let there be piano only, or the guitar only, right? And feel good about it. Oh, here we don't bother about other instruments. We have this one instrument, and we want everybody to only know this instrument, No. If you think of languages, not only as libraries, but think of them also as musical instruments, Each language has its unique musicality, as I said. Also, it's got a lot of histories and so on. And languages can learn from each other. Yeah. That's why I come with a new, not a new phrase. I think hierarchy, no. Network, yes. So that's why it's hierarchy, no. Network, yes. Yeah.
Well, and that's a wonderful note to end on. Networks and communication and pooling together people and voices from all over the world. That's what the Jaipur Literature Festival is about. That's what a library is about. And let's all thank Ngugi wa Thiong'o for his work
thank you.
that is all about this as well. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Maya, as well. Thank you.